So, for those of you who haven't read her book, Tashan is the writer of this very wonderful, whimsical book of fantasy called The Mad Sisters of Esai. Essie. Okay, Mad Sisters of Essie, and it's about two sisters in this island called Essie, and it's set in this universe of very of a spectacular imaginative places like the island of Orja and the Museum of Collective Memory and the Vale of Babel, which are as exotic as they sound. And in a way, the book is as mad as its characters, with its very creative chaos and very lyrical, lush prose. So, Tashan, thank you for that. That's really wonderful book. I really enjoyed reading it. And my first question to you is, the book is centered on these two sisters, and I was just wondering why siblings, because a lot of books are centered on friendships and romances, but the closeness between siblings is less common. So, and there are so many sibling pairs in this book: Lale and Myung, and Visa and Magali, and Kua and his brother. So, why siblings as a central structure of your book? And also, do you have siblings and your relationship with them?
I do have siblings. I have a sister. And the reason why I chose it as the central relationship is I love my sister more than anything, but also I frequently want to murder her. And I have planned multiple ways in which to bury her in different locations that I know her in. And I find that relationship so rich in how you know a person at this intimate level because you grew up with them, right? So you've seen them form, and often your reactions to them, your understanding of them, your love for them is based on a 10-year-old version, an 11-year-old version, a 5-year-old version, and how time is so inbuilt into the sibling relationship. They see you when you're young, they see you when you're old. It's just incredibly rich for how we associate with people. And so I think that's what drew me to it, and that's what I wanted to unpack.
And you were talking about time, and I wanted to ask you because time is such a crucial theme in your book. In fact, you have written on how time fiction time travel is not very common in Indian science fiction.
Absolutely.
And in your book, also, the alchemists in the island of Essie are not alchemists who turn things into gold, but things into time. So time is almost like the ultimate magic. So why this fascination with the concept of time?
You know, I love that you asked me this question because it's a question I've been asking myself repeatedly. What is it about time that I find so appealing? And I think as individuals, I think time has a weight to it. It presses down upon us. There's a cumulative nature to time that shapes how we understand ourselves, know ourselves. There's also a dissonance with time. Who I am right now is not who I was 10 years ago. And that continuity and break, I find just deeply interesting for what it does to the human psyche and how we understand that. And then you've got stories which are just, I mean, you can do anything with time and stories, right? You can break it, you can play it, you can twist it, you can knit it, you can jump around with it. There's this whole malleability and elasticity to it that I find intensely rich. And so in everything that I do, honestly, genuinely in everything that I do, including my next book, it just has time as a central character, a central motive, just because I find that play and pull and push and what it does for character, how we understand the world, incredibly rich.
Is it difficult to play with time because you have to be careful about what a person was earlier, and then that plays into what a person is going to be in the future? So that play with time, do you sort of structure out the arc of a character in time and then mix and match it, or is it like you just do it as it comes?
Oh,
So
it's complete chaos.
okay.
It's complete chaos. I think what you're referring to is continuity, and I fully, but we're not continuous, right? That's what I love about us. We think we are, and we consistently paste narratives that say, okay, I did this, and so I logically am this. But we constantly deviate. We constantly surprise ourselves. Sometimes I look at my life and I think of these large fantasy bridges I have built to who I was in the past to try and imagine where I had come from. And I think that gap, that fantasy bridge we build, I find really, really interesting.
Can you explain what you mean by fantasy bridge? I mean,
So when I was younger, a very simple example, I was a people pleaser, right? I was always nice, I was always sweet, I always wanted to do the nice thing. I'm not that person anymore. I'm an extremely cantankerous human being and I pick a fight with everybody all the time. But you have my parents, for example, encounter me. And when they talk about me, they're always like, oh, but you're so sweet. You must be careful. No one takes advantage of you. And I'm like, I'm not that person anymore. But that bridge that we build, and often when I encounter myself in situations and I behave badly, I tell myself, oh, but I'm so sweet. I possibly haven't behaved badly. And then I'm like, no, I have. And I do need to re examine that. So there's these things you're given in time and of personality that you stitch into who you are. And then when you deviate from that, that change is often difficult to encounter and often difficult to look at. So, Magali, in my book, for example, sees herself as a protector, as someone who consistently takes care of the communities around her. But I mean, by the end of the book, she's just turned into a tyrant. She's essentially used her power to trap her descendants on a singular island, and she believes she's right. So, how that narrative gives us our ideas of right and wrong and who we are, I think that all the contradictions of ourselves I just find incredible.
and you were talking about Magali, right? Okay, Magali. And I was wondering, your book is very female dominated. You might disagree with that, but the male characters like Kua and Jin, especially Jin, he seems very subordinate to Magali, and he's a very passive character to Magali. He's very passionate, aggressive kind of character, and he's the one who takes care of the children. And so, why this female domination in your book? Also, how are women depicted generally in Indian science fiction and fantasy?
So I was thinking about this question, and the very first book I wrote, The Liar's Weave, was centered only on men. And someone asked me why it was centered only on men, and I was explaining that it's set in 1905, and females didn't have that much freedom. And they were pointing out that birth charts are real and people change reality with their lives. Why did I not change this one fact? And what I realized is that in all of the fiction I had read up until then, men were the main characters. And I didn't know how to deviate from that because I was so keen to write something that was good. And when I sort of sat down and I asked myself, okay, forget the word good. Let's write something that you care about. What I was uniquely attracted to was the female experience and how the female experience shapes our bonds with other women. And not all those bonds are good. They're complicated, they're thorny, they're multifaceted. But that sort of complexity, I think I was extremely drawn to. And so the men are there in the book because we have men in our lives. But I feel like it was not their story. They absolutely existed on that periphery. And I made Jin as passive as he is because to me, and I genuinely believe this, the ultimate strength is tenderness. To operate with tenderness and to operate with patience and with care, maybe because it's a skill I don't possess, I think it's just one of the most beautiful things. And so I gave it to him. I just gave him the best quality.
And tell us a little bit about you have you have written about Lord of the Rings,
Yeah.
and that seems to be the touchstone for all fantasy writers. So tell us a little bit about your formative influences and your love for fantasy. Why fantasy?
So I think fantasy is mainly because when I was younger, Philip Pullman's series, The Amber Spyglass, I definitely felt pulled into possibility and into worlds, which I find deeply attractive. But actually, my formative experiences are largely magic realism. So Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Cortázar, Italo Calvino is a huge influence for this book. Invisible Cities, if any of you all have read it, is a fantastic book. And I think what I really loved about what they did is they took the abstract and they made it concrete. So they take all these things that we talk about in philosophy and they give it concrete materialization. And I think that's interesting, right? You can do so much with that. It's like playing with time. It's like making time a tangible object in your books. I'm intrigued by how we relate to that, how we navigate that, and how that helps us understand ourselves.
Right. And madness
Yeah.
in your book is it's very different from, obviously the central theme of the book is the madness of two sisters. It's called the Mad Sisters of Essie. And madness in Tashan's book is very different from madness in our world because Visa's world building is a kind of madness, and Magali's double sight is a kind of madness. So madness is almost a desirable thing in Tashan's book. So I was just wondering, what is madness in your book, and also why this theme of madness?
So when I was writing the book, I found myself sort of imitating all the books that have come before me. So I was dividing it up into pure fantasy tropes of different islands and different people fighting. And I realized that I had got a paucity of imagination. My imagination was failing me. I couldn't think bigger and wider and larger. And the more I sort of started looking at that, the more I started looking at the narratives that we put upon ourselves to understand our world more carefully. Because if we did actually look at the plurality of everything around us, like I think our senses filter out 90% of what we're actually seeing in order to be able to concentrate, focus, operate, in order for us to essentially understand what's essential. What happens if those boundaries are taken away? What happens if how we navigate the world, all these shortcuts our brains have created in order to allow us to function, be socialized, operate in civilization, what happens if all of that is gone? And then I thought you would drown. You would just drown because the world is so intensely large. So, madness in this book is very much plurality, it's very much chaos, it's very much the universe stared at directly without any sort of barrier or without any sort of safety filter on it. And I think I chose the word madness instead of wildness or plurality because we fear madness. There's an undercurrent of unpredictability to it that makes us want to shy away from it, step away from it. And I wanted that word that I choose, that language that I choose, to have that fear already knitted into it and inbuilt in it.
And you mentioned the word chaos, and the book itself is structured in a very chaotic way. It's like here and there, and you piece everything together in the end. So, and I think the beauty of the book is its lushness and its richness and of the world. So did you create the world first and set your story in it, or did you write the story and then create the world around it? Basically, how did you structure your book?
It's always a difficult question to answer. I did 22 drafts of this book. It's not, I mean, I'm not proud of it. I think if I was a better author, I would have done less drafts. It took me 5 years, 22 drafts. It only really came together on the 20th draft. And I think there's a belief in fantasy fiction, for those of you unfamiliar, that world building means you build the world. You basically put all your maps together and you imagine what it's like, and then you set your characters in it. But there's a whole other type of world building by M. John Harrison that says language has its own generative power, which means that any words that you put down create a sense and an image in in the reader's head. Essentially, it draws upon their cultural past and their cultural history, and it brings it to life in the language. And I found that so much more interesting. So those 22 drafts were basically me writing my way into the story, writing my way into the world, and finding a shape that would carry the reader through it. I finished a draft that I genuinely thought was the best draft in the world. And then all my friends read it and was like, this is rubbish. I don't understand anything you said. And I realized it's because I wasn't guiding the reader through my mind or what I was trying to say. So I think there was definitely that keenness in those final drafts of how do I prioritize the reader's journey and how do I pull them through to the end point so they feel what I need them to feel.
Right. And you've written something about a play. You got an idea in a plane, and you wrote. Can you tell us that about that?
So basically, I was working on a contracted book. It was my second book. It was a historical novel. It was very bad. And my publisher asked me how it's going, and I felt very much like crying. And then I was flying back on a plane which was empty because it was Diwali. I was drinking rum and coke, and I was feeling very sad for myself. I was listening all these sad songs. And then the first page of this book basically arrived in my mind. It just flowed. It just came. That first sentence came, and the next sentence came, and I just wrote that whole thing out there. And I got, gosh, I've got it. I've got something that's alive. I've got something that's beautiful. That page doesn't exist in the final book that you read, nor does the idea. It's transformed a great amount. But that feeling of touching something that you know is alive and that is worth saying, I think that's the best feeling in the world.
Is it like the book came fully formed out of you, or did you have to struggle a lot to write it?
Oh, I think the book always existed. I think I find with writing that you have to become the right person to write the book. And I find that very hard because it's there, but you have to look at it in the right way to capture it in the right way. And that took 5 years. Becoming the right person, undoing the way in which my brain connected and making new connections is incredibly difficult. And I'm finding that with the next book I'm working on. I worked so hard on Mad Sisters of SE. I was like, oh, I've got it now. I'm at a certain level. I don't have it. I have no idea what I'm doing for the next one. And I'm remaking myself all over again.
What's it about, your next book?
It's historical fiction. It's set in the 1830s. It deals with the opium trade. It's set in Bombay and the different ways in which Bombay were changing. And now I have to become a historical novelist. And I'm not doing very well at it right now, but I'm hoping over time I will.
I'll just ask one last question before we go to the question and answer session. I was just wondering if you have, because in the US, a lot of the fictional characters, especially superheroes, are inspired by the what happened, in the socio-political climate and the economic climate in America and the world right then. For example, Superman was a creation of or a reaction to anti-Semitism and in the run-up to the World War II, and defending the weak people, the helpless and the weak. So, is your novel a reaction in any way to what's happening in India or the world currently, right now?
I think my first book was to a degree. I don't think Mad Sisters of SE is. I think what it is a reaction to, though, is the dominance of the intellect. I feel like there's a very strong emphasis on logic, on making connections, on essentially looking at those connections very much. And I'm fascinated by what we are leaping over when we make those connections and what we are not looking at. Like what is the power of knowing in all these things that we don't look at, that we don't pay attention to, like our body? And I think this is inspired by the fact that I've been doing a lot of research on therapy, and they were talking about how you think your brain controls everything you do, but actually it doesn't. You have a massive nervous system that's reacting before your brain even steps into the picture. It's already forming information and telling you how to react, and then your brain steps in and goes, okay, I am scared, and this is why I'm scared, or this is how I will react. And that unknowability of ourselves, the unknowability of the world around us, is just infinitely rich if we look at it, if we invite it, and if we accept it. There's a really beautiful Cortázar quote where he says, fantasy is not escapism, it's a way of living deeper in our reality. And that's very much how I write and why I write.
Very beautiful. Now we'll open the floor to question answers. Anybody with any questions?
We all have dreams. Okay, we all do dreams. We have daydreaming. But when someone woke us from a dream or a daydreaming, we have a feeling of incompleteness or a feeling of sad. But my question is, according to Jean-Paul Sartre, a French philosopher, he says that time is a structure of consciousness, but fantasy is beyond consciousness. As an author who dealt with the themes like time and fantasy, my question is, do you think that time is a barrier for fantasy?
I think that's such a great question. So, a Dostoevsky quote that has inspired Mad Sisters of SE and how I wrote it is that I wrote I'm doing a terrible justice to his quote, but basically what he says is, it was as if in a dream where I jumped over space and time and logic and stopped only where my heart delights. And I love that. I love that time is not something to be lived through, but something that you can play with. And that's deeply, deeply malleable. So I don't think time's a barrier to fantasy. I think time is a friend of fantasy, but not how we conceive of time right now in the realist terms. It's this wider lens that we can use to look at time and play with it and hopefully better understand ourselves.
You have time for one more question? Yeah, there's a question there.
Hello, what are your major literary influences?
Oh, great question. So my influences for this book were absolutely Italo Calvino, absolutely brilliant in Invisible Cities. I'm currently extremely influenced by female writers. So Hilary Mantel, Toni Morrison, Anne Patchett.
You have took 22 drafts to finish your novel. It is just like similar to J.K. Rowling of Harry Potter. It was rejected 14 times. What is your take?
lots of rejection in our profession. I think you just have to not look at it. I don't think 22 drafts is wise. This is not, it's not advice, guys. Don't do it. Do it in 2 drafts. But I think that sometimes that's what it takes to get the story where it needs to be.
Excuse me, you said you are no longer a people pleaser.
Yes.
You became a bit more detached. Are you comfortable in that new position?
Oh, I love it. But unfortunately, now lots of people have been giving me feedback that I'm scary, which I think is not the nicest feedback to receive. So it's always a balance, I think, between finding the boundaries of yourself but existing in a collective and operating well in a collective. I'm still finding that boundary. I hope over time it will become easier. But it is, I do find the value of a collective deeply important to me now. Now that I'm thinking of growing a family and all of those things, collective is center. So hopefully at some point I'll be less scary. Oh, Indo-Anglian. My favorite writer is Anglo-Indian. I'm actually really in love with the speculative scene right now. So if you've read Vajra Chandrasekhara, Samit Basu, Lavanya Lakshmi Narayan, they're using their imagination to great scope to sort of do what I think is really fascinating, like absolutely pick apart how we operate in reality and how we function. So I highly encourage you, and I'm very inspired by them to check out the speculative fiction scene.
Hi. So, what I wanted to say is when I read your book, for the lack of a better word, there were times when I was thinking, what am I reading? Because it was very all over the place at times, but I enjoyed it. But what I want to say is that there are certain books that I have read and thought that I've not seen someone from India write in this way. And that being when I was reading Japanese translated fiction, especially like Yokogawa or something like that. It was very wispy, dreamlike, the writing. And I find your writing very similar to that. So, have you drawn any inspirations from authors like that?
I think that's such a beautiful question. I'm not any specific author, but around the time I was writing Mad Sisters of Essay, I was working as an editor on translations. And what that did for me was astonishing because I realized every language has its own approach to story. And it's very different from how English treats story, right? Because every language is malleable in its own way and can shift in its own way. And so reading those books made me realize there is no right way to do it. As long as you do it well, that's all that really matters. And so I was hugely inspired by these. I was reading a lot of Korean literature, this dreamlike quality, this surreal quality that was sort of melted into the prose. And obviously, Latin American writers have been a huge influence. And so I just pulled on all of that to hopefully be a guiding light for writing Mad Sisters. Thank you.
Thank you, Tashan, for that wonderful session. And for those of you who haven't read the book, I would recommend that you definitely pick up a copy. It's really wonderfully written. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the amazing questions. Thank you.